The Art of Genderqueer Storytelling. Don't think of this course as for queer writers only, it's not. This is for anyone interested in understanding ways to create non-conforming gendered narratives. Being queer, a gender outlaw, or anything but cis and straight is not necessarily about sex and biology per se, but it comes with great consequences. It comes with its own culture, it comes with its own way of seeing and being seen, a way of moving through the world, constantly an outsider to the mainstream straight world. And through this slideshow, we're going to help you think about all the challenges and joy brought by being bi or gay or trans or genderqueer or anything that is non-specific, non-gender specific, or non-cis, non-heterosexual, non-cisgendered. And yes, I'll go into those terms in a little bit. But anyway, this is... we're going to think about everything that has an impact on who, when, how, and where we feel safe, where we feel attraction, desire, work. We're going to talk about representation. We're going to talk about permission, the role of family and friends, community, strangers. And only briefly am I going to talk about pronouns. Everything else is what makes a genderqueer story. So let's begin, and we'll start there. So, quick outline for us for this session, this webinar. The basic premise is, unless we know how our identities, language, and culture are based upon a gendered binary, we can't write genderqueer or gender-ambiguous narratives that challenge that status quo. So, in this course, we're going to talk about why representation is needed, who is doing the work, and how are they writing such non-binary perspectives. So in this presentation, you'll get some ideas about how to write and challenge the status quo. We're going to look at what makes us see and assess people by gender, looking for the masculine and feminine. I remember reading once, Jeanette Winterson said in an interview in the 1990s, "People need a narrative of their lives because they don't feel like they've got one." This was in Broad Street interview. And she also said that finding a voice that is really powerful and moving, but nonetheless is not identified as either male or female, would be a very liberating thing. And I have to say that it's true. I found that definitely true in my life as a writer and then as a researcher doing a master's degree, and doing my thesis was on ungendered narratives and what and how we can write outside the gendered boundary, why it was important and how it affected me growing up as a bullied kid in England in a small town for not conforming. And so it's very important that we think of the bigger picture, and I have a feeling that's probably why you're looking at this slideshow, to consider different things that unless you've lived this experience, you might not know about it. And just to give us some tools and craft as writers that we can share with each other and take it from there. My name is Sarah Leamy, just so you know why you're going to listen to me here. I'm a writer, a presenter, and quite a bit of a wanderer. I grew up in Worcestershire in England, and I left there and came to the States in my mid-20s, more or less, after living and traveling around England and Scotland and Wales and then Europe. I spent quite a bit of time in Germany and in Spain, and then I came to the States in my mid-20s. And since then I started writing and documenting things. I had about 5 books published by the time I started my master's in fine arts, which is when I turned 50. So it was quite a journey. I did a lot of different things and wandered around and did a lot of odds and ends and random jobs and random places. And then 50, I decided to take my writing more seriously. At that point, I had a few books published and I wanted to learn more about the craft. And whilst I was there, I went to college in Vermont. in 2017. And whilst I was there, I discovered the work of Eileen Myles, and I listened to them read within a church at a writers' conference in southern Vermont that summer. And the relief made me giddy. She was a role model. They were a role model. Someone who even at that point looked like I did, moved as I did, spoke on similar topics of women lovers, community, city life, drugs, the Southwest, dogs. I felt a kinship, and I was barely able to talk when I bought a book afterwards. "Who shall I write this for?" Eileen asked. I blurted Sarah, and I rarely use the name Sarah. I use my non-gendered nickname instead. So why did I use Sarah at that moment? I don't know. Names make a difference. Or do they? Eileen is a female name, one that comes with connotations and expectations based upon that gender, but Eileen Myles is anything but a typical cisgendered woman. In their own words, Eileen states, "I feel like a gender knot or something. I feel male, I feel female, I feel queer, I feel trans. I feel like I'm a dyke, I'm a lesbian, I feel like a fag sometimes. It's very mobile." Perhaps then my own identity is really as fluid as theirs, reflective of context and community that I'm within. I've outgrown the tomboy label, yet I don't feel trans or male. I'm a woman simply trying to live the life that fits me best, regardless of my biology or of the social contract and social construct of gender. In appearance, I'm more androgynous, and probably in my actions too. And I explore that place in the world, my place in the world, through my agender narratives, through my books. And that's how I ended up discovering and writing about being ungendered or agender, androgynous. I did it naturally and subconsciously in most of my novels, in my first 3 novels. And then through college experience, through the master's experience, I discovered that it was quite rare, and I discovered the different consequences of writing in that way. And so that's what we're going to share today. Is I'm going to share quite a bit of what I learned through the process. This is just an overview, and it's just a beginning point, and I'll do more in different sessions. But for now, I just kind of wanted to introduce myself and the process, and we'll take it from there. For this process, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the slides, and they're immersed in queer culture, and they feature a lot of different people that have had an effect on me as a writer myself, people I wanted to share. Quite a few of the slides have links to videos of other people's work or interviews and the such, so I recommend if you get to those, pause my verbal part and click on the link and it will take you away, and then you can come back and I'll carry on. There's going to be slides with writing prompts and various questions and ideas. So we're going to go through it that way. And each time we'll be building out the same character, ideally, is what I would suggest, is that you create someone that you would like to write about, a character, a narrator that you would like to write about. And we're going to revise and go through that considering different gender markers, point of view, the setting, their concerns, their attributes, their clothes, the language. We're going to, this will be a beginning point, at least, for you to create stories that move beyond coming out and transitioning, and build out a bigger character, a more authentic character that addresses some of the consequences of standing outside the gender binary. This is a slide with some basic terms, a very short glossary. If you want to find more, I do have a pretty in-depth list of different non-binary terms, cisgendered, etc., that I've collected from a lot of different sources, and that's available on the website genderqueerliterature.org. There's a link in the slide that you can click on that will take you there, and you'll find more. But briefly, I just wanted you to read this in your own time with some of the labels: agender, androgynous, cisgender, gender binary, gender queer, and non-binary. Those are the main subjects or the main phrases I use. For myself, I tend to say that I'm agender or androgynous. Cisgender is very much a new to me term anyways, about the concept that there's only 2 genders and that everyone must be that's the where the personal identity comes from, is cisgender being they're happy with they're born into this body and this gender identity that comes with that physical body, and they're comfortable with it. And then most of the others on this list are everyone else. When I worked briefly as a program assistant in an MFA program, Felicia Rose Chavez gave a presentation and workshop on her book, The Anti-Racist Workshop. I lost myself in her stories in the class, in the epiphanies that came from then reading the book afterwards. It was her work had a huge impact on me, and it's very current. It just came out, or this happened for me in 2020, so the spring of 2020. For me, it's important. Her work and her methodology is an important reminder of how the dominant white Western culture really isn't the dominant culture. And the phrase ethnic minorities really isn't true either. I prefer and I'm starting to use more consciously the term a global majority, because this white Western culture that I'm part of, that I am, is not the dominant one, is not the majority, and yet it's erased most of the other cultures and the other things. Our perspective, our point of view as white people is pretty much the default, and I would say that also counts for the default white gaze, the male gaze, the straight, the cisgendered. And so this book and this video link that I've set here, if you click on her name in blue, you'll be taken across to an interview with her, or a presentation from her, that I think is really worth listening to. And I think the anti-racist workshop model is one for all students and presenters to embrace, regardless of what you're teaching and what you want to do, but especially for white people like myself. We need to step outside of blind spots and embrace a bigger picture as far as who we refer to, how we teach, and what we teach, and the way we teach. Anyways, so her work is really worth listening to. It's please click on the video and take a moment to consider how this might affect you as a student and as a writer and as a good human being. She said, we have to ask if tradition serves us and our stories. And I think that's a very good beginning point for when we're writing about characters that aren't necessarily from our point of view. I suggest at this point that we take a break and that we free write. And the process for me, at least, or what I would encourage you to do, is at this point to firstly just write. Take 10 minutes, write about a list of fears that you have about writing genderqueer stories, and don't hold back. The focus is on a messy first draft. Get the ideas out, get your notes out, play with the worries. At this point, especially in this presentation, we're not going to be doing any editing, and we're not going to be doing any revision. And we can do that in later sessions when we can compare what we wrote in this first one and then what we do towards the end of the course. But in other words, each of these phases of writing has its time and its place. And for now, our initial focus is on creating new characters that identify as queer on some level. And we can come back to these pieces later. You might find them as beginning points. And this first time, I'd just like you to take that moment, take those 10 minutes, consider if you're afraid of creating genderqueer narrators and why that might be. And don't worry, this is for you alone, no one else. On the idea of permission to write. Maggie Nelson wrote in The Argonauts, people seem hungry above all else for permission. And I have to say that it was definitely a big part of my career, or what changed for me when I was doing the master's degree in creative writing, was suddenly when I came across people like Maggie Nelson's book, The Argonauts, Eileen Miles, and all these different writers, that I got a sense of permission. I got a sense of do what you do, embrace it, and here's ways to even improve it. And so with that in mind, I kind of wanted to just talk about the idea of what we just wrote, about what holds you back or what your fears are when you're potentially writing queer, genderqueer characters. What do you notice if you look at that list? Who's holding you back? Is it you? Is it someone else? Are you scared of someone else telling you that you did it wrong? But so one step I would say is divide that list into two and divide it into the internal of I'm afraid of getting it wrong, I'm afraid that I'll be an idiot, I'm afraid that I. And the external is when the other side of the list, see which ones fit in each of these boxes. The external is I'm afraid no one will like me if they read this, I'm afraid my parents will hate me, I'm afraid my lover will dislike it, whatever it is. So this is really just a part of understanding your own process, understanding what might be holding you back from wanting to do this, and also maybe highlighting some places you can play with it. So anyways, making mistakes is part of the process. You know, we're not always going to write the best characters. We're not always going to write the best language or the best prose. I'm still learning, absolutely. I carried on to do more research, and I'm now doing a doctoral research at the University of Birmingham in England on this topic. And you know, my supervisors point me in different directions and get me to see different things that I hadn't noticed. So we can all make a difference. We all make mistakes as we create our stories, as we create our characters. And I would say write anyway. You have my permission. You have everyone else's permission. And I don't know if you saw Hannah Gatsby's film, The Nanette, her performance. But there's a quote from that I wanted to use, and it says, "My story has value," she says. "I will not allow my story to be destroyed. What I would have done to have heard a story like mine, to have felt less alone. Laughter," she says, "is not our medicine. Stories hold our cure. And I don't want to unite you with laughter or anger. I just need my story heard." On the idea of representation and the importance, one thing to consider is who's telling their story and how. What happens if we don't see ourselves represented in the media? And how does that affect you or your character? And that's something that came up for me, again, when I was studying and looking into this, when I first started looking into it. I realized how rarely it was that I read stories that reflected my perspective. I can think of about 5, 6 books that I really connected with. And at 54 years old, that's pretty ridiculous. I mean, it's horrendous, actually. Consider all the books you've read over the years, all the movies, all the films, and think about if only 5 of those spoke to you and your lifestyle. So no wonder there's huge issues of mental health issues, suicide issues, not fitting in, not belonging, drug addiction, homelessness, just struggles from small to big, from people that don't see themselves reflected in media, whether it's literature, whether it's podcasts, TV, radio, movies. So think about how, you know, there's such validation in seeing yourself on TV and seeing yourself in others. Gabby Riviera here, who's the highlighted name, she speaks in this video clip about how she had not seen herself in superhero stories and how that affected her growing up, and what that affected, how her career became a career, what she did. She's funny and talented and great storyteller. So stop this little video and listen to her and click on her. And then I want you to think about how also in the Tomboy Survival Guide, Ivan Coyote wrote, "It's hard for me to find words for the kind of lonely I felt in my belly." These two creators both sum up so clearly why we need to include genderqueer narrators. And so if you get a chance, look them both up and sit with it. Think about how much you could change a reader's sense of self by connecting on a deeply human level with one of your genderqueer characters. It can make all the difference. The big question then is how? How do we write genderqueer characters and narratives that stand outside a limited gender binary? And again, my key phrase that I keep using in my research as well is, unless we know how our language, identities, and culture are based upon a gendered binary, we can't write genderqueer or gender ambiguous narratives that challenge that status quo. There's a quote here from Judy Amann, who wrote about Jeanette Winterson's book, Written on the Body, which again was hugely influential on me, with an ungendered, non-specific narrator. And again, in another session, we'll go into a lot more detail about how she created an androgynous or ungendered narrator, what the effects were, what the technique and what the craft was. But for now, this is more of an introduction. But anyway, Judy Amann wrote in her book, Gender, Sexuality, and Textuality, quote, by deconstructing gender norms and the binary understanding of masculinity and femininity, as well as finding an alternative way of thinking about sexuality, Winterson not only manages to successfully challenge the reader's perception about sexuality and gender, but expands the conception of identity to include difference as well. When we consider how we address and assess other people by their gender, the simplest way to describe it is that there are gender markers. There are things we look at to decide whether someone is more masculine and more feminine. We all do it to some extent, but for women, or women that were born women, we grew up being so indoctrinated to consider the level of threat we're under when moving into a new room, public space, who's there, men, women, how many numbers, how many of them, body language, verbal language, tone, energy, and exit points, sense of safety, in other words. And how do we do that? So I'm talking from my perspective, at least, and from what I've learned, is that there are a lot of factors that influence how we perceive people as being either masculine or feminine. And there's a simple way of understanding these gender markers and how we use them subconsciously. And therefore, once you get a basic understanding of these, you can start playing with them and challenging them and subverting them. So you can use, again, if you go to the genderqueerliterature.org website, there's going to be lists there of different things that you can play with and mix and match, so that you know that your characters are stepping outside the expected, the predictable. And so a lot of these, very simply, just to start with, pronouns. I'm actually going to hardly touch pronouns in this webinar, as they are the most conscious aspect of how we as writers decide and describe someone. In my own work, in the first 3 novels, it was subconscious or unconscious, but in each of those 3 novels, the main character was ungendered, and was the editor of the first publisher, the first company, actually insisted that by the end I had to reveal a gender. And the same happened with the second one. And in the third one, the editor didn't mind so much, but she did ask me to be more conscious about using gender markers, so whether it's a choice or not. And so from that, I would say that pronouns are less important to me, and I think by not focusing on pronouns in this course, you'll get a better sense of what else you can do. So, I mean, the most obvious then, the next most obvious to me, is clothes and presentation. How genderqueer people move through the world in their bodies, how they relate to their own bodies, how they dress them, sense of agency, community, idea of the sense of belonging versus fitting in. We're going to talk about traits and mannerisms, skills, jobs, titles, external influences and labels, hobbies, interests, lifestyles. And then, not on this list, but on my own list, shopping styles, shopping styles, cars, motorcycles, first names, nicknames, neutral gendered names, titles, Mr., Mrs., Miss, Mix, Doctor, Nurse, Seamstress, Actor, how someone walks through and moves through the spaces. For example, if you're on a sidewalk, man walking towards a woman, cisgendered man walking towards cisgendered woman, the woman will nearly always be the one to move out of the way. And if not, the man will quite often be surprised that they were either like body checked or they had to maneuver around someone. Sometimes it comes out in anger, sometimes it's just surprise. So these little details are the things that when you're writing, you can create and add to your character's experience of the world. And that will make them a lot more authentic. The idea of agency too, of feeling in the driving seat when it comes to our actions, which think about the age of your characters. As they age, they get more agency. So consider the narrator that you create that's a teenager or a child versus one that's an elder. Spoken language, how it changes depending on context. Who's talking to whom? A sense of safety. Are we code switching? Are we talking about others not present? Descriptions of ourselves and others, the adjectives used, the verbs used by a person and about that person. Our emotions and reactions are different depending on how we were raised according to the gender binary. Physical reactions, relationships, lovers, family, friends, strangers, all treat genderqueer people differently. That sense of familiarity, dislike, understanding, acceptance, judgment. Religion, consider religion and what the local religious community decides about the presentation of being non-gendered or outside the gender binary. The skills taught in schools and self-taught outside. Works and the titles within those jobs, hobbies, entertainments, the type of books, the type of focus, the movies, the games, interactions, the community, the media presentation. Think about environmental factors, class, race, religion, the difference between rural, city, suburban, country and cultures, local needs. For example, Alaskan women need to cut wood, haul water, etc. in extreme temperatures, just like everyone else there has to. And how does that physicality and presentation, how would that be, those characters then being in a hyper high-end, say, Brooklyn situation and a conversation with a business? Think about mental health and addictions that I talked about earlier, physical health, social interactions, education. What was the focus and expectations of the family and the local, the extended family, the social circle that they moved in, and that actual school. Shoes, purses, pockets, hairstyles, height even, driving what kind of vehicle, vanity plates, midlife sports cars, family wagons, SUVs. All of these are details that you can play with and add into your characters and add into your narrators to create and challenge the gender binary. And it's kind of fun when you think about all of this. And if I went over those too fast and there's too much, just make a note or email me and I will give you a more condensed version, okay? A most obvious way that we decide on people's gender or assess considering whether they're more masculine or feminine is on their clothes. And that's one of the first things we notice when someone's walking down the street is their physical embodiment and how they move through the world and also what they're actually wearing. And personally for me anyways, I'm 5'8" and sort of slender build and pretty androgynous, no big curves, no big boobs, no big hips, not particularly flat chested either, short hair that's not, no makeup, boots, shorts, t-shirts. So I don't fit what mainstream America or mainstream Western society would like a woman of my age to wear. And so when I buy clothes, I have a choice, women's or men's generally. And as such, each time I want to treat myself to something new, I'm reminded that my own representation of my own sense of gender identity is wrong, that I am wrong. And even when I go to thrift stores and clothes are divided by men's and women's, children's, girls and boys, it's another slap in the face every time. Every time it's saying that, yes, biologically you're a woman, yes, gender identity is up to you, but if you want to wear that, you have to be a girl. If you want to wear that, you have to be a boy. So consider the language around clothing. Consider what your characters are wearing, how they get them, the actual shopping experience of getting them. How do the people in the store react? How do the people in the thrift store react? How do other people in the changing rooms react when you go in to change, or when your character goes in to change? Consider, what does your narrator wear in private versus in public? And how can you use this idea of gendered clothing for your characters? Because think about, whether it's memoir or whether it's fiction, take some time to really see what this character that you're playing with, or that you would like to play with, what's comfortable to them. How do they change their presentation depending on context of work, of family, or with friends, or when they're just home on a Sunday morning? What do they wear? Like, what makes them happy? Go into great detail, and again, without naming a gender per se, portray a character through the items that they wear. And now just free write for 10 minutes and sit with it and play with it and see what you come up with. How we treat our bodies and how we are presented and therefore represented in media and in art and in literature is changing. And luckily we have people like the link here that you're going to see, that you're going to click on, Camila Falquez. She spearheaded a project called Being, and it reimagines the classical artistic canon from which they've been historically erased. Her photos reinsert black and brown, queer and trans bodies in art history, and it's a beautiful exploration of different people's ways of being comfortable and presenting their own bodies. And I recommend you pause this video for a minute and click on that, and also just take a note of her name and look her up on different formats, different platforms, and see what you can find, because I think you're going to find some amazing work and some amazing images that could also be a really good prompt for future writing. So pause now and have a quick look, and yeah, see what you think. Continuing the idea of representation. So, as we've sort of touched on, mainstream representation of queer people and genderqueer spaces is very often white. And finding a community that looks like you and affirms your blackness or your queerness and the way you can be, is life changing, really. That validation and that sense of permission, that sense of representation, that sense of seeing yourself in others, and that connection is huge. So in the UK, I wanted to give you this example of idvice.com, and you can click on the link and the little subtitle. It celebrates how being queer, how being black, how being trans, how being non-binary can look, and it really does celebrate such experiences. And I have to say that, especially growing up as a kid in England, we did not have anything like that. Yes, I saw white people on TV all the time, not that I was really a big TV person, but there's such, we're still such a minority as, not we white people, but non-binary, trans, queer, genderqueer, outside the straight, white, cisgendered mainstream media. There's still not that many things, and it can be kind of hard to find. I am trying to collect things together on the genderqueer literature website, so if you have any, send them to me. And myself, that, there's also that sense of a safety issue when you're challenging the gender status quo, or challenging what you should and shouldn't look like. And so finding work and sharing the work of more writers, more resources like this website is important. And so if you have any, I really would like you to let me know and recommend them, and I'll include them on the website and include them in future slideshows, okay? So I'd say now is a really good time for another free write. I want you to think about some of the things that you just clicked on and looked at, the art canon, the artwork, the online magazine from the UK, thinking about clothes, thinking about presentation, and write about your character and their own bodies. What do they like about themselves? What do they wear? How do they move through the space? And just put them in a situation, perhaps they need to go buy new clothes for whatever reason, you can make an own reason, but they're going through the process of shopping for new clothes, a new outfit, and just free write from there. Let the other stuff that we just talked about just kind of percolate in the back of your head, and just free write for 10 minutes and see what you come up with. In Persistence, a book called by, let's see, who was it? Ivan Coyote and Zena Sharman. They wrote the book Persistence, Always Butch and Femme, and that came out in 2012 from Arsenal Pulp Press. And it's a really good collection, an anthology of different people's stories about their place within that spectrum of butch to femme. And there's a really good quote here from Chandra Maya, and it says, "One of the things I learned from watching my mother is that not having a word for who and what you are is a lonely and fucked up way to live." And I have to agree. But I wanted you to have that in mind and to think about the external influences on your characters, on your genderqueer narrator. Consider how they grew up. Where did they grow up? There's a huge difference between the rural, suburbia, and cities. There are differences in cultures, in community responses to people challenging gender. Even in New Mexico, where I generally live, there's some towns where I can walk through and I just feel safe and I feel just like myself, say in Madrid, New Mexico, or Santa Fe, or Taos. And then there are others in the southeast corner, which is a lot more religious, conservative, white, Christian, old school, that don't like women like me. And so consider those external influences, the childhood landscapes on your characters. And there's 2 slides following. So I'm going to ask you to just look at those, and you will see there's one is from Botswana and the other one is from rural USA. Both narrators in the videos talking about how they grew up and how it affected them as either queer or genderqueer, and the influences it's had on their lives now. So both are great resources, and we'll have a quick look. In this first video I want you to look at is from Queer Rural Botswana, and the narrator says, "In a time where being brown, queer, African, and seen as worthy of space means being everything but rural, I fear that we're erasing the very struggles that got us to where we are now. Indigenizing my queerness means bridging the many exceptional parts of myself." And so I recommend you pause my speech and click on the video and watch that. She's very magnetic. It's a great little piece. It's just a couple of minutes long, but super worth looking at as a concept of how where we grew up affects how we are and how we move through the world, whether we're cisgendered or queer-gendered. And so have a look at that, see what you think, and then we'll go to the next one. I included this video as another example of ways we can portray genderqueer lives in multimedia manners. I really like the use of, in my own work, especially recently, where I'm using hyperlinks, I'm using video clips, photos, other stories, other quotes, artwork, whatever helps create that story to bring it across. And in this one, Mark Macbeth uses photos, poems, slideshows, and voice to capture growing up in small town Pennsylvania. And think about, as you're going through this process, think about who's your audience and what is the story you want to tell. Are you talking to like-minded people, or are you trying to bridge a gap of understanding from someone that doesn't accept or doesn't understand what it's like to be genderqueer or the different ways we can be in the world? And think about, just see if either of these 2 videos inspire ways that you can create layers and use layers, whether just in your background as you write, you're listening to music, you're watching videos, you're looking at art that might inspire you and make you connect with the character, or up front and for your audience. So watch this one, pause my little video and click on the link, and there's another example. From the perspective of a genderqueer character in Corinne Manning's debut collection of short stories, We Had No Rules, she wrote, The world would bend away from me, even if I wanted to bend towards the world. Now, consider the role of childhoods, or where we grew up. So we're building upon the idea of different rural countries, different rural communities that we grew up in, or our characters grew up in, and think about where your character grew up. Consider how you can use that for your queer characters, whether it's taken from your own life or taken from other influences. Did you know any queer kids or genderqueer kids when you were a child or as an adult? Did you come out as a kid or a teen? How did your hometown react to any sense of queerness in others? Were they open to it? How did your church or your community sources come together and talk about others? Think about what you can bring from your own hometown and past and put that into your character. Put it into a genderqueer character. And so I kind of want you to just think about that, such a basic understanding, basic beginning point of us as children, formative years, right? So free write for 10 minutes about the experience of your genderqueer, non-binary character growing up, whether it's city, rural, suburban, whatever it is, unusual, traditional, and just put your character at home, coming back from school, age 9, free write for 10 minutes, and see what comes out. Identity is an ongoing battle between the external and the internal. How we balance notions of fitting in versus belonging is one that I still struggle with, but I'm working on it. And I've recently come across the work of Dr. Brene Brown, an American researcher and storyteller who does qualitative research on these topics. And she wrote, "Fitting in is about assessing a situation and becoming who you need to be accepted. Belonging, on the other hand, doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are." And she wrote that in The Gifts of Imperfection, which came out in 2010. And so I include her quote and this link, this video, because I want you to take a moment to think about the difference between how we talk about ourselves on our own terms, the labels and joys that come from belonging, from finding that sense of community. And this video, when I first saw it, it made me smile so hard because there was such love and there was such joy, and it's just phenomenal. And it's a combination of all these different influences and American culture and American queers and gender queers, butches, predominantly butches and studs. And it really this video just celebrates female masculinity and the presentation of it on their own terms, and it's just phenomenal. So again, pause this, click on the video, see this, and be inspired. And then afterwards, if you so wish, I would also just sit with it for a few minutes and do another free write. Sit with how you could use that sense of connection and that sense of joy that you see between these women and these butch women and these studs and these trans, how they connect, and put your character in there with them and see what happens. So see what comes out. Free write. I'd like you to consider one of the last slides, we have 2 more to go, is cultural influences, especially musical influences. I would love for you to think about and find a piece of music that is at the core of your character and listen to it on repeat and write for 10 minutes. Just let that music, just feel it, be part of it. For me, if you click on this link, if that's your boyfriend, the sound and the bass and the music and the style, Michelle's voice, everything was a huge influence on me when I was in my early mid-30s. And I just remember how much listening to her music really made me comfortable in my body. And it wasn't my being queer or my being genderqueer, wasn't about trying to fit in. It was about, it was just presenting my sexuality, my desire, my appearance, my comfort, my skills. And so I would love for you to take this is the last free write prompt, but use a musical prompt. Find something that you think is at the core of the character that you've sort of been dabbling with today, and build out from that. Put it on repeat. It could be this one. If you click on her name in blue, it will take you to a video of her playing. So yes, listen to music, put it on repeat, and write for 10 minutes. Cooper Lee Bombardier, someone I met and who lived in Santa Fe around the same in the early 90s, no, late 90s. When I was here, I was in and out. We sort of ran in the same groups a little bit. But this book, Pass with Care, is his first book of memoirs. He's been telling his stories on stage, in zines, in performances, and now more recently in this, which came out in 2020. And I strongly recommend it. Um, Cooper wrote, "Much of my early writing about gender was a way of responding in conversation to others when I was unable to do in the moment in person." And I'd say that's true. A lot of this writing and writing on the page is so much easier because you can pause, you can reflect, you can write. And so I hope that you'll take a lot of what we've talked about today and the different links and the different influences, and you can click on Cooper's name here and see a video of him performing live. I think it's with Sister Spit maybe, or in Portland, probably Oregon. And just listen to how the stories can be so much more than just coming out and transitioning stories. A lot of my hope is from sharing these kind of information, at least even this brief overview, is that you start thinking about how you can create genderqueer characters that come from humanity, that come from their actual experiences, as opposed to simply changing a pronoun or changing someone's dress. There's so many influences on all of us, whether we're cisgendered or genderqueer, non-binary, whatever our identity is. There's so many influences, and I hope that you sit with this slideshow and watch it, follow the links, follow the different rabbit holes you go down, keep writing, keep playing with it, and see how it can help you create more authentic genderqueer stories from outside the boundaries, outside the binaries, the boundaries, and to play with it. Okay, so I hope the new knowledge settles in and that you enjoy this and that you can use more. Again, if you have any questions, contact me and we can build out in a future series. But before we go, I want to do one final free write, and it's a really open-ended one. And I just wanted to give you a quote from Lydia Yuknovich, the American author, professor, mentor. She's been a huge champion for me, a huge influence on me, and I got to work with her in 2019, 2020, early 2020, in person on a manuscript. And her positivity and her influence on so many people is huge. And so I'm just going to give you this quick quote from her, and then I'm going to ask you to do one last free write, one last 10-minute loose write of whatever that is, whether it's however it is. So she wrote, "Gender and sexuality are territories of possibility. Never mind what we've been told or what the choices appear to be. Inside artistic practice, the possibilities open back up." So go with that, sit with it, and write. So in summary, I wanted to remind you that Maggie Nelson wrote in The Argonauts, "People seem hungry above all else for permission." And I know I was as a writer, and I know that a lot of people are, a lot of my ally friends that would like to include more genderqueer writers, more genderqueer characters and narrators, but didn't feel like they had the permission or the knowledge or the experience to do so. I hope this little presentation will give you a little more confidence and a few avenues of where to find genderqueer culture so that you can look to see what other people are doing and how they do it. We're going to think about a quick summary of what we just covered was consider what holds you back and whether you needed that sense of permission. Talk about the need for representation and community and how it's life-changing. Think about the childhood places and external influences on your characters, on your genderqueer characters, how they move through space, how they move through the world. Think about bringing queer pride from our pasts into our futures. Use multimedia elements if that helps, if that gives you a fuller picture, or even if it's just as a prompt to help you get started. Think about external presentation and what's involved and what's at risk when we do that, when we step outside the expected look and style and clothes and behaviors. Think about sexuality, music, desire, beyond coming out stories, beyond transitioning stories, just life, people just living, how we connect to strangers, how we connect to families, how we go through the world in our own bodies, how other people view our bodies. So there's a lot of different odds and ends to play with, and I hope this helps. And we will do more. I have more where I'd like to go into more detail about Jeanette Winterson's Written on the Body as a really fine example of how to write an ungendered narrative. I'd like to look more into Ivan Coyote's various stories and books as a way of how so much of his work has been about the stories and growing up in Alaska and less about his gender identity. And again, a fine example of storytelling, genderqueer storytelling at its most simplest and its most finest, and different musical influences, different cultural influences. And so we'll just keep expanding this, and we'll carry on, and we'll see you hopefully in the next little bit. You can find more resources through the various links I've added. If you have any questions, you can contact me through my own website, which is sarahleamy.com. And you can also contact me through here. I think there'll be a comment box underneath where you see this. And so you can let me know what you think there, or if you have any questions, okay? So one final thank you for going through this. Don't forget, you can submit your own work, or if you have resources or suggestions, go to genderqueerliterature.org, and there's a contact form and you can put in things there. I'm also looking to highlight and publish more genderqueer stories and prose and poetry, nonfiction. So if you have anything, send it in and we'll try to publish it, or we'll work with you to make it publishable and fit the tone of what we're doing. And then one last thought just to walk away with, again from Lydia Yakunovich. Literature is that which fights back against the oppressive scripts of socialization and good citizenship. She ends her book Misfit Manifesto by reminding us, wherever you are not alone. Even in aloneness, I can hear you and I am smiling. So, thank you.